A father threw his 15-year-old daughter out of the house for being pregnant. Weeks later, he regretted it and went to look for her, but what he found left him in complete shock. The Smith home was located in a modest neighborhood where rows of houses lined narrow cobblestone streets. That afternoon, Caroline had prepared a simple chicken broth while anxiously awaiting the return of her husband, Robert. She knew the situation at the factory where he worked was dire and suspected he would arrive with a furrowed brow, much like in recent days. Even so, she tried to maintain a harmonious environment so as not to worry their daughter Jenna more than necessary, as the girl had just come home from school looking noticeably tense. Robert entered through the main door without the usual smile on his face. He placed his lunchbox and safety helmet on a small wooden table in the foyer, letting out a sigh that echoed through the living room. Hearing him, Caroline came out of the kitchen with a damp cloth in her hands and glanced sideways at him, attempting to gauge his mood. She cautiously asked how his day had gone, but he only shook his head in silence. "I ran into Daniel before leaving," Robert said, taking a seat on an old armchair. "The rumors about layoffs are getting stronger, and not just that. There are hints they might shut down an entire section of the plant. I don't know when things got so out of control." Caroline released a restrained sigh. She was worried about her husband's unstable employment, although she tried not to show it too much. She preferred to project a sense of security, knowing he needed a calm space at home. Still, internally, she wrestled with the desire to help financially and the fear of how Robert would react if she confessed her plans. Just then, Jenna, who had been in her room attempting to finish her homework, approached the living room with hesitant steps. She wore a slightly wrinkled school uniform, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She greeted her parents shyly, avoiding prolonged eye contact with her father, feeling a lump in her throat that threatened to overwhelm her. Robert noticed her pallor, but attributed her reserved manner to adolescence and the stress she might be feeling from seeing her parents so worried. Meanwhile, Caroline needed a break. During a brief, free moment, she visited her neighbor, Sophia, with whom she shared a trusting relationship. She quietly confided her intention to enroll in a bookkeeping course to find a more stable job or at least an additional source of income. Sophia listened attentively and encouraged her to take that step, reminding her how important it was for women to have their own pursuits. Nonetheless, Caroline felt genuine fear. She didn't know how to explain to Robert that she wanted to do something on her own, and she feared he might feel undermined. Meanwhile, Jenna stayed in her room, staring at the wall clock as it marked the minutes with relentless precision. She felt a tingling anxiety in her stomach. She could no longer ignore the situation weighing on her, and she knew the time was approaching when she'd have to tell her family. But the image of her father, face strained by worry, made her question whether this was the right moment to reveal news that would undoubtedly disrupt all their plans. When dinner time arrived, the family gathered around the table. The steaming bowl of broth seemed unappealing given the tension in the air. Robert ate in silence, consumed by his thoughts about the factory. Caroline offered gentle smiles, trying to ease the atmosphere. Only Jenna looked away, haunted by the secret she could no longer hide. That same night, after clearing the dishes and helping her mother dry them, Jenna gathered her courage. She knew Robert was about to review some paperwork from work, but before he could lock himself in his small study, she approached him, her voice trembling. Despite her fears, she could not remain silent any longer. She stood in front of him and, drawing a deep breath, uttered the words she had been rehearsing for days in her mind. "Dad, there's something very important I need to tell you," she said, trying to hold his gaze. Her heart was pounding in her ears. "I know this isn't the best time, but I can't keep it to myself any longer." Robert noted the resolve in his daughter's eyes and set aside the papers. Caroline, who had heard Jenna's voice from the hallway, came closer with the sinking feeling that something serious was about to happen. A heavy silence settled in the room, broken only by the faint buzzing of the fluorescent light. Jenna felt her palms grow sweaty and her throat go dry. Seeing her parents so expectant, She realized there was no turning back. In a quiet voice, she dropped the news that would change their lives. "I'm pregnant." Robert remained motionless for several seconds after hearing Jenna's confession. The revelation, as unexpected as it was crushing to his plans, sparked an emotional whirlwind he didn't know how to handle. He kept sitting, staring at a vague point on the wall, while a tense silence filled the air. Suddenly, he stood up brusquely and fixed a severe look on his daughter, as if trying to confirm that this wasn't just a cruel joke. His first reaction was disbelief, but the seriousness on Jenna's face made it impossible to dismiss. His expression hardened into barely contained fury. The echo of "I'm pregnant" pounded in his mind like thunder. He felt as though the ground had opened beneath him. Struggling to speak coherently, he demanded details. Whose baby was it, and how had she let it happen? Although Jenna tried to explain, no answer soothed him. Robert could see only an uncertain future, and in his frustration, he began blaming her for ruining not just her own prospects, but the family's peace as well. Caroline, caught between shock and the instinct to protect her daughter, moved closer in an attempt to intervene. She pleaded with Robert to soften his words, reminding him that Jenna was just a frightened teenager who needed support. However, the tension fed by the layoff rumors and his sense of disappointment led him to react harshly. He couldn't accept that his little girl, whom he still saw as a child, was now pregnant. Nor could he handle the added responsibility at a time when his job was on the line. Robert's voice rose until it became desperate shouts. He accused Jenna of destroying not only her own life, but everyone else's. With tears in her eyes, Caroline tried to calm him, begging him to stop speaking that way. Yet his anger soared beyond reason, and in a sudden outburst, he pounded the table with his fist, startling them both. His words cut like ice when he turned to Jenna, a mix of anger and sorrow on his face. "If you decided to live like an adult, I'll show you what that means. You're not staying here. You need to learn that actions have consequences," he pronounced, his voice cracking at the end. Jenna, stunned, felt the floor slip out from under her. She had expected shouting and reproach, but she never imagined her father would throw her out. She looked to her mother, who wept uncontrollably, trying to convince Robert to reconsider. Still, he stood firm. He kept repeating that he was doing it for her own good, so that she would understand the magnitude of her mistake. In his mind, shutting the door on her would force her to confront reality and hopefully come to her senses. With her soul in pieces, Jenna ran to her room to pack a small suitcase. She hurriedly gathered some clothes and personal items, still unable to comprehend what was happening. Her thoughts whirled: fear of the future, sorrow over her father's rejection, and guilt for disappointing her parents. As she headed downstairs, she saw Caroline clutching the banister, begging Robert to change his mind. But he stood there, unyielding, holding to a resolve that didn't seem natural for a loving father. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Sophia, Caroline's neighbor and confidant, stepped outside and saw Jenna leaving with her suitcase, tears streaming down her face, her steps unsteady. Sophia approached with boundless compassion, offering a hug. Yet all Jenna could muster was a soft "thank you" before walking down the street, aimless and gripped by dread. Sophia, powerless, stayed beside Caroline, who collapsed into silent sobs. Left alone in the living room, Robert tried to convince himself that he'd done the right thing. He muttered under his breath that it was his duty to teach Jenna that every action had a consequence, and that this was the only way she would learn not to make such serious mistakes. Even so, deep down, a seed of remorse began to take root. He pictured his daughter on the street, vulnerable and confused, yet fury kept him from turning back immediately. Jenna walked away into the night, guided only by the glow of the street lamps. Each step weighed heavily on her, as though her own shadow followed her with a guilt she didn't know how to bear. Tears blurred her vision, and she wondered if her father's decision was final or if there was any way back home. Robert, for his part, stayed at the house's threshold, struggling to breathe, conscious of the chasm that had opened between him and his daughter. Jenna walked for several minutes under the darkness of night, clutching the small suitcase in her hand. Fear and uncertainty consumed her, yet she kept moving forward, hoping to find a friendly face. Upon reaching an old, somewhat run-down building, she took a deep breath before climbing the narrow, steep stairs. She knew that on the other side of the third-floor door lived Alice, her best friend since childhood. When Jenna knocked, her hands trembled uncontrollably, and she silently prayed that Alice would welcome her without judgment. The door opened, revealing the surprised look of the young woman, who quickly noticed the pallor and the tears threatening to spill from her friend's eyes. Without a single question, she motioned Jenna inside with a gentle squeeze of her arm. Alice lived in a tiny studio apartment, with modest furnishings and peeling grey paint on some of the walls. There was a cramped, open-plan kitchen and a sofa that doubled as a bed. In spite of her own hardships, Alice didn't hesitate to take Jenna in. She had her sit down, offered her a glass of water to calm her nerves, and waited patiently for her to explain. In a shaky voice, Jenna recounted the events at her home, her father's uncontrollable anger upon learning she was pregnant, and the moment he threw her out without hesitation. Amid sobs, she confessed to wandering the streets aimlessly until she remembered that her only hope was the person who had never failed her. While Jenna found shelter in Alice's humble yet warm apartment, tension and silence filled the Smith household. After the outburst that drove him to expel his daughter, Robert was torn between guilt and wounded pride, unable to bring himself to apologize. He kept telling himself that everything had been for Jenna's own good, yet deep down, he felt a gnawing emptiness. Unable to bear the weight in silence, Caroline confronted him in the early morning. Heart heavy, she reproached his harshness and demanded that he take responsibility for his actions. Rather than accepting blame, Robert justified himself with cold arguments, maintaining that this harsh lesson was necessary for Jenna to grasp the consequences of her behavior. Still, his own words rang hollow. The following day, at dawn, Robert arrived at the factory with no desire to talk. The dark circles under his eyes betrayed a sleepless night, but he tried to maintain a stern expression to hide his vulnerability. Daniel, his friend and co-worker, immediately noticed the strain on his face and worried about his state of mind. Rumors of partial shutdowns continued to swirl, and supervisors were under intensifying pressure. Daniel pulled him aside in a remote corner of the company cafeteria to ask how he was doing. Though Robert tried to dodge the topic, his somber demeanor spoke louder than his words. He barely managed to mention that things were going badly at home and that he didn't know how to fix his mistakes. Daniel urged him to find Jenna and approach her differently, but Robert just looked away, clinging to the idea that his actions were correct in theory. Meanwhile, in Alice's small apartment, details came to light that explained the young woman's generosity. Years earlier, Alice had fled her stepfather's home, a violent man who, after her mother's death, had turned their lives into a nightmare. With barely any resources, she had run away to seek a better future. She worked the night shift at a hostel, earning just enough to cover rent and basic expenses. Still, despite her precarious situation, she didn't hesitate to offer Jenna a place to stay until she could figure things out. Perhaps it was because she recognized in Jenna the same vulnerability she had once felt in her own skin. As the hours passed, Jenna found fleeting relief, aware that Alice's kindness was her only support for the moment. Nevertheless, she remained on edge, terrified of being tracked down by her father and forced to return home. Sensing her friend's anxiety, Alice realized she needed to protect her, at least until things settled. When Caroline and Robert's calls began to light up her phone, she was torn between loyalty to her friend and concern for the Smith family. In the end, seeing Jenna's tears each time the phone rang, she made her choice. She would not reveal Jenna's whereabouts. Alice knew Robert's anger still simmered beneath the surface and feared that giving him the girl's location would only lead her back into the line of fire. That day ended with the two teenagers huddled together on the small sofa bed, feeling that, Despite the world closing in around them, at least they still had each other. Meanwhile, in the Smith home, Robert wrestled with sleep, haunted by the image of Jenna, and wondering if he had crossed a line from which he could not easily return. In a distant neighborhood from the Smith household stood the Brown family's home, surrounded by scarcity. Unfinished walls and makeshift roof tiles spoke of the hardship there. Inside, an almost suffocating tension prevailed. Don Mark, a stocky man with a perpetually stern expression, sat at the head of a simple wooden table while his wife, Carmen, tried to serve him a plate of beans and tortillas. Not even the aroma of the food could ease Mark's chronic bad temper. A few steps away, their son, Ryan, was cleaning the handful of tools he used in the part-time job at a workshop. His hands were stained with grease, and frustration weighed heavily on him because he couldn't contribute more money to the family. The workshop paid him just enough for personal expenses, with little left to help at home. This constant shortage, together with his father's rigid nature, pressed down on him like a stone. Mark's harsh demeanor traced back years to when he had worked at the same factory where Robert Smith was a supervisor. Mark never stopped insisting that he had been unfairly fired, blaming the management for concocting reasons to get rid of him. He said no one had come to his defense at the time, and his resentment only intensified with the passing years. Each time he ran across someone from the factory or heard a rumor about it, his anger surged anew. And although Carmen attempted to calm him with words of resignation, Mark would endlessly rebuke those he held responsible for his downfall. That afternoon, matters grew tenser still when Mark mentioned the name Jenna. His dark eyes narrowed, reflecting a seething contempt. He had heard rumors about Ryan's closeness to the girl, and in his view, any connection to the Smith family could only cause trouble. He repeatedly grumbled that his son was messing up by involving himself with someone from that family, which he blamed in part for his own ruin. Even though there was no clear proof of Robert's direct influence on his firing, Mark believed every supervisor there had been complicit. "I don't know what you're thinking," Mark growled at Ryan. "If that girl's gotten herself into trouble, it's best you stay out of it. We're flat broke, and then they'll come asking for help." Ryan gritted his teeth, holding back the bitter reply he wanted to give. He was well aware his father could explode at any moment, and deep down, he wanted to prevent a more serious confrontation. Carmen, trying to keep the peace, placed a gentle hand on Mark's arm. "Come on, don't make unfounded accusations. Ryan is a good boy. Besides, Jenna isn't just anybody. We've seen her around, and she seems like a well-behaved girl." "Well-behaved?" Mark scoffed. "You really think those Smith people are decent? Back when I worked at the factory, they all turned their backs on me. They're all the same, little supervisors who act like they own you." Ryan lowered his gaze. He wanted to help Jenna if she needed it, especially since he himself had a hand in the situation she was facing. Even so, he dreaded his father's reaction. Mark could become aggressive when things didn't go his way, and the last thing Ryan wanted was to spark further conflict at home. Despite that, he felt a strong pull to do something for Jenna. Just then, a neighbor passed by the Browns' gate, calling out for Mark. The man went outside with his typical suspicious expression. Hearing the neighbor's words made Mark's brows knit together. The neighbor revealed that Jenna had been expelled from her home by Robert. At that news, Mark glanced back toward his house, with an almost triumphant gleam in his eyes. "See that, Carmen? That Smith family has always been a sham. Look what they've done," he shouted, a bitter satisfaction in his voice. "They can't even look after their own daughter." Upon hearing the news, Ryan felt his stomach drop. If Jenna had truly been thrown out of her home, she would be in a highly vulnerable position. The fear of Mark's reaction collided head-on with his desire to offer her a roof over her head. Meanwhile, Carmen tried to intercede in a concerned tone, asking where the girl might be. But Mark, blinded by resentment, merely muttered his contempt for the Smith family under his breath, resolute in his decision not to get his own involved in other people's problems. Even so, the shared bitterness hinted at a larger conflict on the horizon. Robert spent the night tossing and turning, his mind anchored to the image of Jenna leaving the house with her suitcase in hand. Each time he closed his eyes, he pictured his daughter wandering alone, aimless. Weary of the guilt and uncertainty, he got up before dawn and dressed in haste, determined to find her. Though his pride still simmered beneath the surface, the worry for her safety outweighed any lingering anger. From the bedroom doorway, Caroline watched him, wanting to ask where he was headed at such an early hour, but restraining herself when she saw the desperation etched into his face. At first light, Robert went to the school where Jenna was enrolled in high school. He spoke with the security guard and a few teachers roaming the halls, hoping for any clue about her whereabouts. To his growing frustration, no one had seen her in days. She hadn't shown up at the little corner cafe she normally frequented with her friends either. Undeterred, he continued searching at the park, where Jenna often met with people. There, he questioned several passers-by, but no one recalled seeing a schoolgirl wandering around at that hour. As the hours passed without any clear answers, Robert began to wonder if he should give up this roundabout search and go straight to Alice, Jenna's closest friend. Though he suspected Alice might know something, he dreaded the reproaches he'd likely face. Still, the fear of his daughter being in danger compelled him to swallow his pride. He made his way to the old building where he remembered Alice lived in a small apartment. He climbed the steps, his heart pounding, until he reached a door in a dimly lit hallway. When Alice opened the door and recognized Robert, her expression hardened. She did not invite him in, standing firmly in the doorway. He tried to offer a polite greeting, but the icy look in her eyes made it clear he was not welcome. Alice, still resentful, condemned his inhumane act of throwing Jenna out. Her voice wavering, she recounted how her friend had arrived completely distraught and had nowhere else to go. Robert, feeling a sharp pang in his chest, tried to explain that he'd acted in anger, but Alice showed no mercy. Even so, after several tense minutes, she noticed the exhaustion and genuine worry on the face of a man who, deep down, was still a concerned father. With a sigh, she gave him only a scant hint. Jenna had moved elsewhere in search of greater peace, though she didn't disclose an exact address. "That's all I'm telling you," she stressed. "The best thing you can do is learn from your mistake and treat her with the respect she deserves." Back at the factory, Daniel sensed Robert's agitation. During a short break, he pulled him aside and shared an unsettling piece of news. Management was planning to close part of the plant. If that happened, it would lead to strikes, layoffs, and an atmosphere of instability that could easily spiral out of control. Feeling overwhelmed, Robert sensed the world collapsing around him. Not only was he in danger of losing his daughter, but his livelihood hung by a thread as well. Daniel insisted they stand united and stay alert, as tensions between the workers and executives grew daily. Meanwhile, Caroline, ever more convinced she needed to find a way to support her family, started talking to Sophia about enrolling in a night school accounting course. Optimistic as always, Sophia encouraged her, saying it was never too late to gain new skills. Still, Caroline hesitated, afraid Robert might see her plan as an insult to his ability to provide for the family. In the midst of this inner chaos, Robert remembered that, some time ago, Jenna had mentioned a boy with the last name Brown. He added that to the clue Alice had given him. Maybe his daughter had sought refuge with that young man's family. He recalled that Mark Brown, a former factory worker, harbored deep resentment over being fired. The mere thought of Jenna living under the roof of a bitter, hostile man made Robert's heart clench with dread. With few options left, he decided to track down the Brown family's address. Just as he was about to leave the factory in search of that household, his phone rang. Daniel's agitated voice came through the line. "Robert, rumors of a walkout are about to become reality. If they don't reach an agreement soon, the workers might stop production." In that moment, everything became even more urgent. With the need to find Jenna and the responsibility of facing the factory's looming crisis, Robert felt as though his life had split into two equally pressing fronts. The weight of his decisions became unbearable, and remorse began to seep into his eyes for the harsh words that had driven his daughter away. Robert arrived at the humble brown home with his heart racing, well aware that this encounter would not be pleasant. The neighborhood, poorer than his own, stretched along narrow, dusty streets lined with unfinished houses and rusted gates. At the far end of a neglected block, he recognized the rundown facade where, according to his inquiries, Mark Brown lived. Bracing for a likely rejection, he walked to the door and took a deep breath before rapping on it with his knuckles, striving to remain composed. After an awkward pause, Mark himself opened the door, hostility etched into his features. He was a sturdy man, marked by the lines of resentment and countless losing battles. His gaze locked onto Robert's as if facing a longtime foe, making no effort to hide his scorn. Before Robert could manage a formal greeting, Mark let out a snort of indignation, leaving no doubt he was unwelcome there. "What do you want?" Mark snapped in a gravelly voice, his words echoing through the cramped entryway. "I need to speak with Jenna," Robert replied, trying to sound conciliatory, though nerves betrayed him. "I just want to make sure she's all right." From inside the house, Jenna heard her father's voice. A wave of relief and anger washed over her, so intense it lodged a lump in her throat. She couldn't believe that, after everything, he had the nerve to show up here, trying to rescue her. Carefully peeking out through a side window, she watched the exchange between Mark and her father, her heartbeat thrumming in her ears. Mark refused to let Robert take a single step past the door. He fixed a piercing glare on him and raised his voice, confirming the years of pent-up resentment he'd been nursing. "Now you care about her?" he spat. "You, one of those people who ruined my life at that factory, you come here asking for sympathy? How ironic is that, huh?" The tension was palpable. Ryan, Mark's son, stood quietly off to the side of the yard, trying to fix a problem on his motorcycle. He yearned to speak up for Jenna, but fear of openly confronting his father stopped him. He knew his opinion counted for little when faced with Mark's wounded pride and Robert's pent-up fury. Staring down, he pretended to focus on the bike chain, trying not to become a target for accusations. Robert, for his part, tried not to retaliate in kind. He forced himself to keep his tone measured, but his anxiety slipped out as imprecise words. Attempting to apologize for what had happened, he also demanded that Jenna return home, as though his remorse still hadn't quite taken root. His speech sounded clumsy and disjointed. He wanted to repair the damage, yet he insisted on setting his own conditions. "I realize you're angry, Mr. Mark," he said, voice barely steady, "but I'm asking you to let me speak to my daughter. I know I made a mistake, but I want her to know she can come back, that she can count on me." Mark's eyes hardened even more. He stepped forward, blocking Robert from even glimpsing the living room. "You and your people never gave a damn about us," he replied bitterly. "Do you know how many times I begged the supervisors to review my firing? No one listened. And now you show up, asking for favors. Get out of my house before I lose my temper." From behind a tattered curtain, Jenna felt a jolt in her chest. Mark's words rang with the fury of someone who'd felt betrayed for years. She could sense her father's clumsy attempt to apologize, weighed down by his unwillingness to fully acknowledge the hurt he'd caused. Even so, a pang of sympathy rippled through her. She wanted to burst out and confront both men, to say she was tired of this pointless feud. But her emotions were in turmoil. She still ached from the rejection of being thrown out, and it pained her to see Robert so broken. Stunned by Mark's unyielding stance, Robert stepped back, forced to leave empty-handed. His final glance mirrored helplessness and shame. As he walked away, he murmured something like an apology, but nobody heard it. On the other side of the door, Jenna remained in silence, watching the swirl of dust left in her father's wake. A knot of sorrow and anger tightened in her chest as she thought, "How dare he come looking for me now, after he kicked me out?" And so, with the bridge between these two men in ruins, Mark's bitterness and Jenna's confusion growing, the situation only worsened. Robert departed under a dull sky, feeling each step sink him deeper into the mire of his own guilt. Meanwhile, in the modest Brown household, the air remained thick with resentment, and Jenna wondered if there was any way back to the family that had once sheltered her. The tension at the factory had grown almost unbearable. Workers moved through the corridors with strained expressions, whispering discontent that intensified by the day. Daniel, visibly concerned, searched for Robert in the supervision area to relay the news that was spreading like wildfire. Management was on the verge of announcing pay cuts and contemplating the partial shutdown of one section of the plant. The confirmation hit everyone hard, as the potential consequences were unpredictable. Robert stood before Daniel, at a loss for how to react. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him. As a supervisor, he had to maintain a delicate balance. If he sided with the workers, he risked losing his job, or at best, earning the distrust of his superiors. On the other hand, supporting management meant betraying the labor force, which in many cases had valid grievances. He couldn't forget what had happened years ago when the factory fired several employees, among them Mark Brown, leaving them without severance or clear explanations. While Robert wrestled with his thoughts, the managers called an urgent meeting. There, they officially announced that salaries would be cut to reduce operating costs and, they claimed, stave off total bankruptcy. Most of the workers reacted with barely contained outrage, while some raised their voices, threatening walkouts or protests. Robert watched the scene with a heavy heart. He knew a major conflict was looming, and he couldn't ignore that Mark had once been a victim of a similar injustice. Perhaps these workers had every reason to be hostile. At the same time, in the Smith home, Caroline was experiencing a turning point of her own. To her surprise, she had been granted permission to enroll in a night school accounting course. Relief clashed with her unease at not knowing how Robert would react to the news. However, this opportunity could provide the family with financial security, especially given the crisis bearing down on the factory. Sophia encouraged her to seize the chance with conviction, reminding her it was an important step for her personal growth. It wasn't long before labor unrest reached a boiling point. In the hallways, Robert noticed the severe looks from various workers who viewed him as an intermediary for the bosses. Daniel, for his part, tried to mediate and calm tempers, but with each passing hour, rumors of a strike grew louder. Some employees began recalling past incidents of unfair dismissals. Mark's open wound flared again in the words of those who had witnessed too many injustices. Robert could barely focus on his daily tasks, besieged by the fear of losing everything, his position, the workers' trust, and in some way, even the chance to win back his daughter. The final straw came at the end of an evening shift. Two workers approached Robert in the parking lot, fists clenched and fury clouding their eyes. One of them, in a gravelly voice, hurled a direct threat that made Robert's blood run cold. "Don't you dare side with the bosses, or you'll regret it." Robert felt the ground quake beneath his feet. He could only stammer a shaky, "Calm down, I just want to help," convincing no one. The men walked off, leaving behind the echo of pent-up anger. That moment was a breaking point for Robert. With the crisis on the brink of exploding and his family in turmoil on multiple fronts, he realized that any decision he made would not only affect his job, but also the course of his entire life. Under the looming threat of a strike and with hostility on the rise, he returned home filled with doubt, a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. Even so, he clung to a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, by supporting the workers honestly and seeking real dialogue with management, he could avert a full-scale confrontation, and at the same time show Jenna that there was still a way to mend his mistakes. Ryan woke up early that morning, surveying the precarious state of his home with a sense of dismay. He had spent the night listening to Mark grumble about the factory's situation and the alleged injustices that led to his firing long ago. While Carmen prepared a simple breakfast, Ryan went over to Jenna, who slept on the small living room sofa beneath a threadbare blanket. Noticing her weary look as she woke, He gathered his courage and sat beside her, suggesting something that had been on his mind for days. "Jenna," he began, voice a bit unsteady, "don't you think it would be better if you stayed here more permanently? I know my dad's difficult, but I don't want you sleeping without a roof over your head." Jenna looked at him with both gratitude and concern. Living under the same roof as Mark was no small challenge. Since she'd arrived, he had barely acknowledged her, and when he did, it was usually to fire off bitter remarks about the Smith family. Even so, she had few alternatives. Alice's place was cramped, and Jenna couldn't bear to impose. Besides, she couldn't forget the moment her father, Robert, kicked her out, making the idea of going back to him feel remote. "I'll think about it," she replied, attempting a smile. "Thank you, Ryan. Really, I appreciate your concern." Carmen entered the living room with a plate of tortillas. Though she treated Jenna kindly, the girl sensed underlying tension. Mark, meanwhile, grew more abrasive each time he saw her, as though her mere presence served as a reminder of old wounds inflicted by the factory. That silent hostility ate away at Jenna's peace, and the constant stress was hardly good for her in her condition. Back at the Smith home, Caroline tried to maintain an air of normalcy, but inwardly she was consumed by worry. She had received confirmation of her enrollment in the night school accounting class, and although Sophia encouraged her to go forward, she couldn't shake her guilt about focusing on herself when Jenna was still gone. As a mother, she felt compelled to protect her daughter at all costs, especially now that Jenna was pregnant. With that resolve, Caroline spoke to Robert again, insisting they needed to convince Jenna to return. He, overwhelmed by the looming labor strike and impending pay cuts, was at a loss on how to approach her without doing further harm. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, exhaustion etched into his face. "Every time I try to see her, I end up fighting with Mark, and I'm not even sure Jenna wants to talk to me." Caroline, however, was determined. Her voice trembled as she insisted they mend the family bond before the pregnancy advanced further. "She needs you, Robert. Even if she doesn't say it, she's still a child, and this baby can't arrive in the midst of so much resentment." He nodded with a defeated look, knowing guilt was still gnawing at him from within. That same day, Alice stopped by the Brown household to check on Jenna. She'd heard rumors of tension with Mark and wanted to be sure her friend was all right. Upon arriving, she sensed the heavy atmosphere. From the hallway, she heard Mark and Carmen arguing about some financial issue. Alice dared to greet them with a firm tone, and after a brief silence, Jenna stepped out to meet her. "Are you okay?" Alice asked, hugging her tightly. Jenna simply shrugged. "The only good thing is that Ryan supports me," she admitted, "but I don't know how much longer I can stand his father glaring at me like I'm an intruder." Mark peeked out for a moment and gave her a hostile look before leaving, grumbling all the way. Alice quickly realized she wasn't welcome and didn't insist on staying. She told Jenna to call her right away if things got worse. Just before departing, she noticed Jenna's hand resting on her belly, a nearly instinctive gesture of protection. Meanwhile, Sophia visited Caroline and found her poring over her course materials. The neighbor congratulated her on taking such an important step, reminding her not to give up despite the family's hardships. Caroline nodded, but her eyes betrayed the tension of someone unsure if she could handle everything at once. Tensions at the Brown home reached a critical point by nightfall. After a long day, Mark came home in a foul mood and started complaining about the expenses he couldn't cover and the extra mouth he was feeding that brought nothing to the table. Feeling the sting of his words, Jenna mustered the courage to respond, her voice shaking, explaining that she never wanted to be a burden and never chose this situation. Mark jumped to his feet, raising his voice and accusing her of freeloading. Ryan tried to intervene, but his father silenced him with a glare packed with years of pent-up fury. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest. She raced out to the backyard, where the night was dark and only a single dim bulb provided any light. Leaning against the wall, sobs she couldn't contain overtook her. She realized she could no longer stay there. As much as Ryan cared about her, the toxic atmosphere would destroy her. She had to leave, but she had no idea where she would go or how she would support herself with a baby on the way. Right then, she decided she would leave that house as soon as she could, even if it meant venturing into the unknown. The morning dawned cold, the chill soaking through to the bone and heralding another day of tension. Jenna, exhausted after a sleepless night, forced herself to get up early. She had resolved to leave the Brown home at the first chance she got, but before taking that final step, she attended the medical appointment she had scheduled weeks ago, a visit critical for checking on her pregnancy. Ryan, keenly aware of the constant clashes with his father, decided to go with her. The two left in silence, careful not to cross paths with Mark. Upon arriving at the clinic, they found the waiting room nearly full. A wave of dizziness hit Jenna as she realized all these people had direction in life while she was feeling her way forward, blind with uncertainty. When they finally called her name, she walked in with her head down, bracing herself for whatever the doctor would say. As soon as the appointment began, the doctor, speaking in a calm voice and looking at her kindly, confirmed what she already suspected. Her pregnancy was progressing as expected, but would require frequent checkups and special attention. Even though she was young, her emotional situation made her more vulnerable. The doctor emphasized the importance of proper nutrition, adequate rest, and a supportive environment. Fighting back tears, Jenna nodded in silence. She couldn't stop thinking about how far she felt from anything resembling stability, and how Mark's hostility had pushed her to the brink. When they left the examination room, Ryan took her hand, a gesture of solidarity that she appreciated. Walking through the clinic's corridors, she mustered the courage to mention the conversation they both knew they had to face. "Ryan, I can't keep staying at your house. Your dad can't stand me, and I don't want you fighting with him because of me." Ryan frowned, his expression tinged with helplessness. "I know my dad is difficult, but I don't want to leave you out on the street. Jenna, I don't have much either, but have you thought about going back to your parents?" His words stopped her in her tracks. It wasn't the first time someone had suggested she return, but she couldn't forget how Robert had thrown her out without a second thought. And yet, part of her longed for her family's protection, especially now that her condition required constant care. Meanwhile, at the factory, Daniel found himself in an equally pressing dilemma. With the workers growing more incensed at the pay cuts and lack of prospects, they were pressuring him to choose a side in the imminent strike. Daniel, being Robert's friend, knew Robert was in a tight spot as a supervisor, but he also recognized that the workers' demands were justified and that management was inflexible. That morning, he sat down with Robert in the plant's small cafeteria, bringing him up to speed on the group's stance. "It's only a matter of time," Daniel explained gravely. "Either you speak out against these cuts, or they'll end up seeing you as a traitor, someone kneeling to the higher-ups." Robert, elbows resting on the table and gaze drifting, had no response. His thoughts were split between remorse for having expelled Jenna, fear of losing his job amid a possible strike, and the responsibility of mediating between two warring sides. Mark's story flickered in his mind, a man who'd been put out on the street years ago due to the factory's unjust practices. Back then, Robert had stayed silent for fear of retaliation. Now he wondered if that made him partly responsible for the man's misfortune. Back at the Brown home, things grew tense when Mark learned, from Carmen's murmured comments, that Jenna was going to medical appointments and getting help from Ryan. Mark saw that as a direct challenge to his authority. Anger consumed him further when he suspected that the girl planned to leave. To him, it felt like a personal snub, reinforcing the idea that no one trusted his word. "They leave as if this was a hotel," he roared, slamming the table with force. "Why did you come here in the first place, Jenna, if you can't stand a bit of scolding?" His words fell like a heavy stone on the young woman's spirits. Ryan tried to defend her, but Mark refused to listen. Each disparaging remark was a reminder of how impossible living together had become. That afternoon, Jenna worked up the courage to dial her home number. Her throat went dry as the line rang, and she wondered if she should hang up before anyone answered. But the moment she recognized Caroline's voice on the other end, all her resentment dissolved into restrained sobs. "Mom," she managed to say, "I'm willing to come back, but on one condition. I don't want Dad rejecting me again. I couldn't bear it." Caroline, trying to steady the surge of emotion in her chest, listened carefully. She promised that this time she would do everything she could to make Robert reconsider. And in that exchange, heavy with relief and fear, they both understood that Jenna's return would not be easy, but it at least opened a door to reconciliation. The call ended with Caroline's hands shaking and Jenna's eyes brimming with tears. The Smith family's future again hinged on a choice that, amid the labor crisis and pent-up resentments, would mark a turning point. Though the road ahead looked uncertain, there was still hope that coming back home might mend the bonds that had almost been severed for good. Jenna arrived at the Smith house a little after midday, carrying a small suitcase and an emotional mix so intense she couldn't meet anyone's gaze. Her heart was pounding so hard when she knocked that she was sure the neighbors must hear it. She recalled the terrible moment when Robert had thrown her out. Now, crossing the threshold again filled her with uncontrollable fear. Yet, when the door opened, she found herself facing her father, whose expression was half relief, half shame. Their reunion amounted to a restrained hug. Neither Jenna nor Robert could find the words to express the whirlwind of feelings running through them. He awkwardly rested his hand on her back, mustering only a terse, "I'm sorry." Even so, that brief gesture eased some of the tension. Caroline, who peeked from the hallway with tears in her eyes, hurried over to join the embrace. Her presence served as a bridge in that awkward moment, trying to patch up the family's cracks with her warmth. Jenna stepped inside and noticed that while most of the furniture was in its usual place, something in the atmosphere had changed. The silence weighed heavily, as though each object had learned to hold its breath. Robert avoided looking her in the eye, fully aware that his pride had opened a rift too wide to be easily mended. He excused himself, saying he needed to return to work, mentioning urgent matters at the factory. In truth, he needed space to process the emotional load of that homecoming. Jenna, meanwhile, stood quietly with her mother, unable to form complete sentences. Over the course of the afternoon, Caroline devoted herself to lightening the mood. She had prepared Jenna's old bedroom, adding small decorative touches and making the bed more comfortable. Between fresh sheets and new curtains, she tried to convey the idea of a fresh start. From time to time, she glanced anxiously at her daughter, worried that lingering resentment might eclipse their chance to talk. Yet Jenna was too exhausted to do more than reply in monosyllables, her soft voice expressing gratitude for her mother's efforts. When Alice stopped by for a visit, she found Jenna sitting on the edge of the bed, staring into space. She was relieved to see her friend under a safer roof again, even if it felt precarious. After greeting Caroline with a brief hug, Alice sat beside Jenna and spoke in a hushed tone so as not to disrupt the fragile calm that prevailed. Concern coloring her voice, she shared that Ryan also planned to leave Mark's house if the tension continued. Hearing that made Jenna's throat tighten. She knew how much Ryan wanted to protect her, but wasn't sure if his leaving with her was the best idea. The mere thought of that possibility made her fear the confrontation that might erupt with her boyfriend's embittered father. Meanwhile, in the living room, Caroline heated water for tea and seized the moment to tell Alice about enrolling in the night school accounting course. Speaking softly, she confessed her excitement about bettering herself, but also her worry about neglecting Jenna's pregnancy and the crisis they were all facing with Robert. Alice encouraged her to keep moving forward, assuring her that studying was a necessary investment, especially in these uncertain times. That evening, Robert came home from the factory with worry etched into his features. In his first real exchange with Jenna, he muttered a few halting questions about how she was feeling, studiously avoiding any delicate topics. She replied in a subdued tone, avoiding eye contact. Caroline watched the scene with a knot in her stomach, well aware that reconciliation wouldn't be immediate. Still, sharing the same roof was progress, however small it might be. Just then, a phone call from Daniel shattered that fragile peace. The urgency in his voice seeped through the line and onto Robert's face. When he hung up, everyone sensed something serious was going on. Speaking barely above a whisper, he explained that a strike at the factory was virtually unavoidable and that management planned to lay off even more staff before the work stoppage began. Tension gripped the room anew, reminding every member of the Smith family that their troubles didn't end with Jenna's return. The burden of guilt and the desire to mend their bonds had just been joined by the looming labor crisis, an unstoppable threat creeping closer by the day. The accumulated tension at the factory burst inevitably when the workers decided to go on strike. It was a cold, dark morning, and not even the first ray of sun could calm tempers. The hallways were filled with whispers and drawn faces. Some workers gathered at the main entrances with hastily made signs, while others blocked off certain access points to disrupt activity. Robert arrived early, hoping to get ahead of the chaos descending upon both him and the rest of the staff. Upon entering, he immediately ran into Daniel, who greeted him with a tense nod. Daniel quickly informed him that several groups of workers had secretly organized to sabotage parts of the machinery, hoping it would push management into a quicker negotiation. Management was refusing to back down on the wage cuts or the planned partial shutdown of the plant. Robert, feeling a surge of blood in his temples, regretted that things had escalated so much. As a supervisor, he was in a heart-rending middle ground. He didn't want to lose his job, but he knew the people were desperate. While trying to inspect the production area, Robert discovered at least 2 machines deliberately put out of service. Loose bolts, disconnected cables, and the stench of burnt oil attested to the depth of discontent. He felt betrayed, especially because he had maintained cordial relationships with most of the workers over the years. Now, however, they saw him as just another arm of management, a man who couldn't stand up for them. For a split second, he recalled Mark's bitterness, the bitterness of someone who'd been unjustly fired in the past for protesting similar conditions. Reflecting on this, Robert couldn't help wondering if his silence had made him complicit in a grave injustice. Meanwhile, at the Smith home, Jenna was experiencing a whirlwind of emotions that began to affect her health. Returning home hadn't offered the peaceful refuge she needed. Her relationship with Robert remained strained, and constant uncertainty about her baby's future fed her unrelenting stress. One evening, while Caroline was busy in the kitchen preparing a light supper, Jenna suddenly felt dizzy and fainted in the hallway. Though the fall wasn't severe, it set off all kinds of alarms. The family doctor, called in urgently, explained that malnutrition and anxiety could have caused her to lose consciousness. He recommended closer monitoring and a more balanced diet, as well as an emotionally stable environment, a tall order given the circumstances. Meanwhile, Daniel and Robert clashed again at the factory. In the midst of rolling blackouts orchestrated by the striking workers and the protest-laden atmosphere, they had a heated argument in one of the makeshift offices. Daniel believed Robert needed to show more empathy for the people under his supervision. "They're tired of empty promises," Daniel snapped. "You can't blame them for fighting for what's rightfully theirs." Robert, his expression tight with worry, could only see the danger of escalating sabotage that might shut the plant down for good. "And if they destroy everything, and management decides to close the factory for good," he shot back, "who's going to pay our wages then?" At that point, they both recalled Mark. Daniel mentioned how the man used to speak out against the same injustices. When management decided he was too rebellious, they fired him without a second thought. Robert felt a stab of guilt. He'd been at the factory around that time and had never done anything to oppose it. Perhaps remaining silent had also made him part of the problem. Still, he resisted admitting it openly. His fear of losing his livelihood trapped him in a vicious cycle he couldn't seem to escape. Outside, tensions rose further. Striking workers chanted slogans and banged pots and pans to attract local media attention. Among them were whispers that management wouldn't give in this time either. In the midst of this turmoil, a small group of outraged protesters, furious about years of mistreatment, sought out Robert for an explanation. When they spotted him, they hurled direct threats. "You helped let them do what they did to Mark," one of them snarled, eyes full of anger. "If you're with the bosses, you'll pay for it." Robert, paralyzed by fear and confusion, could barely speak. He felt everything around him collapsing: the factory that provided for him, his relationship with the workers, and his own family, where Jenna needed support now more than ever. The threats, loaded with pent-up resentment, made it clear there was no middle ground. They saw him as an obstacle in their struggle, someone embodying the power structure that had caused them so many headaches. Inwardly, Robert wondered if he really was to blame for allowing the injustice to take root and grow until it led to this seemingly unsolvable crisis. It was a harsh morning at the factory, with the strike ongoing and workers barricading the main entrance. A heavy air of anger, fear, and frustration hovered. Hand-painted signs flapped in the wind, and their chants echoed off walls that for years had muffled any outcry. Amid this storm of discontent, Mark appeared, dressed simply and wearing a hardened expression that mixed determination with deeply rooted resentment. He had come to demand the severance pay he insisted was wrongly denied when he was dismissed. Noticing him approach, some workers recognized him and made way, knowing he'd been clamoring for justice for a long time. Mark walked until he stood before the makeshift management office, where Robert was trying to keep tempers in check. Upon spotting him, Mark's demeanor instantly hardened. They exchanged looks charged with more than mistrust. They were laden with years of resentment, misunderstandings, and unspoken guilt. "You," Mark called out accusingly. "I came looking for the bosses, but I find you here instead. Did you come to cover up for them again?" Robert, nerves frazzled from the recent threats, struggled to keep his voice steady. "Mark, I'm not covering for anyone. I understand that you're upset, but—" "Understand?" Mark let out a bitter laugh. "They fired me when I protested these very same injustices, and I never got my severance pay. Did you know that? Did you let it happen?" The workers' voices grew louder. Some had gathered around, waiting to see if a confrontation would erupt. At that moment, Daniel stepped in. He had worked with Mark years ago and remained close to Robert. Positioning himself between them, he raised his hands in a gesture of truce. "That's enough," Daniel said in a conciliatory tone. "Listen, the old management did a lot of dirty things. Mark, you know that. Robert, you were just an assistant supervisor at the time, right?" Mark gritted his teeth. "They all say the same thing. We were just following orders, but someone had to sign the papers justifying my dismissal." Robert shook his head, feeling a lump in his throat. "I never had control over layoffs. My boss back then was the head supervisor. I was still learning, and I never handled sensitive data. I swear I didn't know those reports were falsified." In the ensuing commotion, a worker who had also been around in those days recalled the name of the now-retired supervisor who'd left years ago without explanation. Rumor had it he'd doctored data to weed out problematic workers, and it was confirmed in that very moment, as though a veil had suddenly fallen away. Mark remembered seeing that supervisor's signature on his dismissal papers, but had always assumed everyone, including Robert, had conspired to get rid of him. Daniel seized the hush that followed to appeal to both men's sense of reason. "Robert, Mark, maybe it's time to join forces. You can file a claim or negotiate a settlement if you can prove there were irregularities. Most of the workers already suspect that the retired supervisor doctored those reports." Those standing around them looked on expectantly. Mark took a deep breath, recalling the hardship he'd endured after losing his job. Suddenly, the prospect of finally getting the severance pay the company had never given him took on a deeper sense of justice, more than just personal resentment. "And you?" Mark asked Robert cautiously. "Would you be willing to talk to management on my behalf?" Robert felt a stab of remorse. He realized his silence in the past had allowed abusive practices to flourish. Without overthinking, he nodded. Yes, Mark. I'm willing. I know how hard it is to stand up to the company alone, and if the old management falsified reports, we need to expose it. A ripple of surprise passed through the onlookers. Visibly moved and somewhat ashamed, Mark rubbed the back of his neck. Maybe I blamed you without proof, and that's been fueling my anger all these years. Maybe I targeted the wrong enemy. Robert's eyes teared up, aware that some path to understanding was opening. Daniel, relieved, watched them both with hope that this turning point might bring a bit of light to the workers' struggle. The crowd parted slightly, giving them a small circle of privacy amid the chaos. In that moment, Mark realized that, beyond all differences, Robert was also a mere cog in the malicious machinery the plant's administration had set in motion. For the first time, Mark lowered his guard. Robert, for his part, felt a little lighter. If he helped Mark, maybe he could finally make amends for the guilt that had eaten away at him for so long. With this unexpected alliance on the horizon, the strike rolled on, but a glimmer of hope sparked in many eyes. After all, if Mark and Robert could join forces in the name of truth, maybe there was still a path toward the reconciliation and justice these workers so desperately wanted. Though unrest persisted at the factory, following that unlikely encounter, the conversations aimed at restoring the rights of unfairly dismissed workers took on a new direction. Robert and Mark, still eyeing each other warily, agreed to hold periodic meetings to map out a strategy. Mark would demand the severance pay he'd never received, and Robert, for his part, would offer a channel to management. Daniel mediated between them, trying to maintain calm in the midst of labor instability and the growing concerns of others who'd endured situations similar to Mark's. Within this turbulent environment, the Smith family went through its own changes. As Jenna grew closer to her due date, it became clear she was experiencing an inner shift that manifested in her attitude toward Robert. One afternoon, after a routine checkup, she found her father out on the porch, gazing thoughtfully into the distance. Aware that their truce was fragile, she approached slowly, uncertain how to break the silence. At last, she summoned the courage to speak. "Dad," she murmured, calling his attention. Robert turned with a look of uncertainty, perhaps bracing for another reproach. Yet Jenna, her voice calm, offered him a faint smile. "Thank you for letting me come back, and forgive me for holding a grudge against you." The girl's words fell like a soothing balm on Robert's heart. For weeks, he had been carrying the guilt of having thrown her out in a moment of rage, fearing the damage would be irreparable. That's why his breath caught slightly when he realized Jenna was offering him the first steps toward reconciliation. With a subtle tremor, he hugged her. It wasn't a joyful embrace, but rather a calm and profound one, in which father and daughter felt, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that there could be a bridge between them. Life at home also began to improve. Caroline, having successfully completed the first module of her accounting course, felt fulfilled and accomplished. Though she didn't hold a big celebration, she invited Sophia over for coffee to share the small victory. Sophia congratulated her enthusiastically, highlighting the importance of personal growth and showing her family that her self-improvement could coexist with household responsibilities. Eyes glowing with pride, Caroline thanked her friend for her unconditional support. Meanwhile, Alice was experiencing a moment of financial relief. The hostel where she worked nights had offered her a promotion that would allow her to handle part of the administrative duties, an opportunity that meant a better salary and slightly more flexible hours. This news arrived like a breath of fresh air. For a long time, she had been barely making ends meet. Now she dared to dream about planning her future, and maybe even revisiting her goal of studying nursing, a dream she had postponed due to life's many urgencies. At the factory, the meetings moved forward with great caution. From time to time, Mark showed up with Daniel, holding discussions with Robert in a neutral space. Progress was slow, but at least there was a chance that certain files could be reopened and suspicious dismissals thoroughly reviewed. Although the strike still hadn't been fully called off and tension remained high, the notion that a supervisor and a former employee were teaming up to expose past injustices gave several workers a glimmer of hope. Back at the Smith home, Jenna spent part of her time getting the baby's room ready with her mother. They bought a few diapers and some simple baby clothes, aware that money was tight, but determined to prepare a welcoming space for the newborn. Although father and daughter didn't have long, in-depth conversations, there were signs of courtesy between them. Robert even got involved in picking out a basic crib, revealing a genuine desire to make amends for past mistakes. One evening, though, while the family was eating a light supper, Jenna felt an unusual cramp low in her abdomen. At first, she thought it was a passing discomfort, but the pain came again, more intense. Caroline hurried over, worried, as Jenna's face went pale. Breathing hard, Jenna clung to her mother's hand, her body tensing up. "I think something's not right," she whispered, eyes brimming with fear. Another wave of pain struck then, nearly toppling her. Alarmed, Robert sprang to his feet, suspecting the moment they had all been expecting might have arrived, far sooner than planned. Supper was forgotten on the table as he and Caroline rushed to steady Jenna and call an emergency doctor. In the scramble, they realized she was experiencing strong contractions. Though the immediate future looked uncertain, there was something in everyone's eyes that suggested the family, after so much conflict, might rally around the imminent arrival of the baby. Jenna felt each passing minute intensify the contractions. Sharp waves of pain coursed through her, and she briefly felt the world blur around her. Robert and Caroline moved quickly, carefully settling her in the back seat of the car and driving toward the nearest hospital with anxious hearts. Throughout the ride, the girl squeezed her mother's hand, trying to stifle the groans escaping her lips. Her thoughts fixed on the baby, arriving earlier than expected, apparently determined to appear without warning. Ryan, alerted in a rush by phone, arrived just in time to follow the Smith car on his motorcycle. He barely managed to keep his focus on the road. Fear gripped him, and uncertainty about Jenna's and the baby's well-being tightened like a knot in his chest. Still, he refused to give in to panic. This moment was far too important. Hospital staff received them promptly. A stretcher appeared to wheel Jenna into the emergency department, while Caroline and Ryan hurried to complete admission forms. Robert, unsure of what else to do, paced back and forth in the corridor, impatient for any information. Silence reigned, interrupted only by the hurried echo of footsteps and the steady beeping of monitors coming from other areas. Shortly afterward, Mark and Carmen arrived, both looking as though they'd run miles to find a taxi. Mark's face was lined with worry, deeper creases forming on his brow. Spotting Robert, he hesitated to approach, but in that moment of acute anxiety, resentment stepped aside. They exchanged a look that acknowledged their shared fear for Jenna's health and the baby's. A brief nod was enough to close some of the distance that had separated them for so long. "Any news?" Mark asked, voice gravelly. "Not yet," Robert replied, avoiding eye contact but sounding less brusque than usual. While they waited, Carmen and Caroline drew close, offering each other comfort. Both women felt the same anxiety over their daughter and realized that, despite all the arguments and differences, the only thing that truly mattered now was for the birth to go smoothly. Ryan, slumped in one of the metal chairs in the waiting room, fiddled nervously with his hands, never taking his eyes off the operating room doors where Jenna had been wheeled in. On the other side of town, the factory also struggled with tension. The strike and protests continued, although somewhat dialed back thanks to Daniel's mediation. Acting as a temporary supervisor, he managed to dissuade some workers who were still considering extreme measures to sabotage the machinery. He explained that the negotiations with management could reopen and that damaging machines would only give the company more excuses to lay people off. Though not everyone was fully convinced, some began to see that class action lawsuits and reviewing wrongful dismissals offered a better path than destroying equipment. Meanwhile, Sophia, steadfast friend to the Smith family, had decided to stay at the house, keeping things in order and standing by in case anything else came up. She straightened the kitchen, made sure the lights were turned off, and kept the phone within reach. Though her experience in emergencies was limited, she wanted to do her part to ease Caroline's and Jenna's worries. Every few minutes, she found herself praying silently that the birth would go well and the baby would be healthy. In the hospital waiting room, tension was almost tangible. Mark and Robert, once bitter enemies, were now sitting near each other. Though they said nothing, their occasional glances betrayed a concern they shared. Caroline sat next to Carmen, clasping her hand in a gesture of solidarity. Ryan paced, eyes glued to the hallway that bustled with busy medical staff. For a moment, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath to steady himself. Memories of clashes with his father, along with Jenna's despair, mingled with the hope of holding his newborn soon. The minutes dragged on painfully. Finally, the operating room doors swung open and a doctor with a serious but calm expression appeared. Everyone jumped to their feet, hearts racing. In a measured tone, the doctor looked at them and said the words that would end their anguish. "The mother and baby are stable. You'll be able to see them soon." A collective sigh swept through the waiting room. Caroline pressed a hand to her chest, fighting back tears of relief, while Robert closed his eyes, thankful the roller coaster of emotions had ended on a positive note. Ryan felt his legs shake, and Mark, without saying a word, released a breath laced with days, or years, of resentment and anxieties. That announcement marked a pivotal moment. The baby's birth not only brought Jenna and Ryan into the adventure of parenthood, but in some way it also offered the promise of reconciling two families long separated by grudges and misunderstandings. Jenna settled into the hospital bed, cradling the tiny baby who was barely opening his eyes. The exhaustion of childbirth ebbed with each heartbeat of that new life breathing against her chest. Beside her, Ryan watched with a mix of tenderness and pride, unable to hold back the smile spreading across his face. As a nurse approached to check their vital signs, Jenna took the chance to kiss the baby's forehead and whisper welcoming words. Caroline, calmer now that the ordeal of the past few hours was behind them, entered the room quietly. Seeing her daughter transformed into a mother, she couldn't hold back a tearful surge of emotion. All the doubts and past disputes felt irrelevant in that moment. Jenna reached out and beckoned her closer to share in the wonder of this child who was now part of the family. In a trembling voice, she expressed her gratitude. "Thank you for not leaving me alone, Mom." Robert appeared in the doorway with a newly discovered sense of discretion. He still wasn't used to the idea of being a grandfather so soon, but there was a peculiar light in his eyes. He approached Jenna silently. After a moment, he bent down to give her a gentle kiss on the forehead, murmuring, "I love you, my daughter," to which she responded with a relieved smile. The partial reconciliation they had begun to forge now took shape with the baby's arrival. That spontaneous moment of closeness between them dispelled the tensions that had kept them apart for so long. Mark and Carmen arrived soon after. The man, usually sullen, stood at the door with a certain hesitation. Jenna invited him to come in, and he approached, visibly moved. When Mark saw his grandson, a trace of tenderness softened his hardened features. In that instant, he realized that this little one was a bridge between his family and the Smith family. Without waiting for any cue, Robert came over to offer him a sincere handshake. It was brief, right there in the hospital corridor, but long enough to promise a new beginning. Both men admitted there was no point in dragging out old grudges and vowed to join forces in the labor rights struggle still ahead of them. Meanwhile, Caroline waited for things to settle before sharing a decision she had been weighing for days. She caught Robert's eye and, in a gentle voice, told him she did not plan to drop her accounting studies. During her first modules, she had discovered a calling that made her feel fulfilled. This time, Robert neither argued nor objected. On the contrary, he nodded with understanding and quietly acknowledged that he couldn't go on making every family decision without consulting her. A few hours later, Alice arrived carrying a simple but thoughtfully chosen bouquet. As soon as she saw Jenna in bed, the two of them shared a joyful hug. Alice congratulated her friend on the baby and revealed news she had kept secret. Her recent promotion would allow her to save enough money so she could, in the future, enroll in nursing school. That possibility, along with Jenna's success in making it safely to childbirth, filled them with hope that long-deferred dreams might finally come true. Shortly afterward, Daniel appeared looking noticeably more relaxed than in recent days. He carried a small bouquet, but also had news for Robert. The factory management, pressured by the strike and proof of wrongful dismissals, was willing to reopen negotiations. There were signs they might seek a less heavy-handed approach to layoffs and even consider reviewing old files like Mark's. Now, the supervisor and the former employee had the opportunity to combine their efforts, amplifying the workers' voice. In the days that followed, nerves and relief went hand in hand. Once Jenna recovered, they organized a small gathering, a symbolic christening for the baby, attended by the Smith and Brown families, along with Alice, Daniel, and Sophia. Held in the Smith family's modestly decorated patio, the occasion had a friendly tone. Even though problems still lingered, the factory remained in flux, money was still tight. Everyone sensed that, by standing together, the challenges might be easier to face. During that simple celebration, Robert and Mark talked about their plans to bring legal action against the retired supervisor who had falsified reports. Aware of how demanding parenthood would be, Jenna and Ryan supported each other, closer than ever. Caroline happily shared her progress in the accounting course, grateful for her husband's new support. Alice, smiling shyly, spoke of her nursing plans, buoyed by those who knew her dedication. And Daniel, pleased about the easing of tensions at the factory, emphasized the need to reach fair agreements for everyone. As the sun began to set, its soft light casting long shadows on the neighborhood streets, no one wanted the gathering to end just yet. It continued in scattered conversations, shared jokes, and quiet admiration of the family's newest member. In that scene, one that would have seemed impossible not so long ago, it was clear that despite the fractures, a spirit of rebuilding, solidarity, and genuine family unity had emerged. This story shows how pride and desperation can tear apart even the strongest family bonds. Both Robert and Jenna became trapped in a whirlwind of decisions made under pressure, without measuring the consequences of their words and actions. However, love and the need to look out for each other ultimately overcame their resentments. On the one hand, we see how essential open communication is. When silence and reproaches pile up, a single outburst of anger can destroy harmony. On the other, we also realize that each person carries their own wounds and frustrations, often tied to external problems like an unstable job market. This fact nudges us to be more empathetic with those around us, recognizing that dealing with stress and uncertainty isn't always easy. Finally, the arrival of a new family member symbolizes a chance to renew commitments and heal past tensions. The baby, belonging to both families, becomes a bond that paves the way for forgiveness and reconciliation. Likewise, the story highlights the importance of mutual support. Caroline's studies, Alice's efforts to get ahead, and the workers' struggles at the factory all found more satisfying resolutions through collaboration and shared empathy. In the end, what stands out is the capacity of people to correct their mistakes, pool their strengths, and build a more hopeful, equitable future. Respect, forgiveness, and solidarity emerge as the indispensable keys to turning conflicts into opportunities for growth. That's all for today's story. We hope this account, full of lessons, emotions, and reconciliations, has touched your heart. Remember that every family is unique, and sometimes second chances are exactly what's needed to mend what seems broken. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that encourage reflection. Leave a like and a comment letting us know what you thought and what you took away from this story. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next video.